My name is Ned Bowman, an outreach biologist with Great Basin Bird Observatory, for those of you who do not know me. This evening we have Ben Sonnenberg, a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno, and he's going to talk to us about some fun new research that they've been doing on mountain chickadees there. Originally we were hoping to do this event in person, but the coronavirus had other plans, as is sort of the theme of the past few years. So we excited to bring this to you virtually and reach you in all corners of the country now, hopefully. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ben, and I will go ahead and shut up and let him talk about chickadees. So here you are.
Well, thanks so much, Ned. Yeah, well, I really appreciate the invitation. And let me just share my screen here. Okay. Yes, well, thanks so much. Tonight, we're going to be visiting our field site up in the Sierra Nevadas and talking about mountain chickadees and a few of the drivers of within species differences in spatial cognition and cognitive abilities. And I'll dive into that as we go. But I just want to say thank you for GBBO for just having me here and for allowing me a chance to speak with you all tonight. And it's going to be, hopefully it's going to be a good time. So yeah, just to reintroduce myself, my name is Ben Sonnenberg. I'm a relaxed birder, which has been really nice here in Nevada, more of armchair birder sometimes. And I love avid out in the woods all the time. This is at our field site. And I'm originally from Montana, so I'm a Westerner. I've kind of been all over the place, working on species of waterfowl, raptor, and red crossbill before returning to graduate school at the University of Nevada, Reno, where I'm in the 5th year of my PhD program where I work on mountain chickadees. And today I'm going to be sharing with you guys a little bit of my dissertation work. And so I come from a behavioral ecology lab at the University of Nevada, and my advisor, Dr. Vladimir Pravosudov, if you guys are interested in learning more about the research, runs a website called chickadeecognition.com. And so feel free to visit that website and take a deeper dive into some chickadee biology. But I'm part of the Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology graduate program there at UNR. And so behavioral ecology and specifically chickadee cognition, well, what does that mean? So I'll be using the word cognition a lot tonight. And when I say the word cognition, I'm referring to the mechanisms by which animals can acquire, process, store, and act on information from their environment. And that includes perceiving the environment around them, right? Taking in the environment, all the information around them, then learning from that information, storing that information, and then acting on that stored information, those memories, to make decisions in the future. And so all of those things fall under this definition of cognition. And we're specifically going to be talking about learning and memory, and specifically spatial learning and memory in relation to chickadees as we go on. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the mountain chickadee. There are many chickadee species across North America. There's actually, I think there's around 57 species of parrots worldwide. So just for fun little tidbits, chickadees actually came to North America in 2 waves, right? The titmice relatives about 4 million years ago, and chickadees and their modern relatives about 3.5 million years ago, and colonized North America from the old world. So the highest density of, or highest diversity, I should say, is actually around the Himalayas. And so we received chickadees probably like somehow through Alaska, and then they trickled down and took residence across North America. And we have, mountain chickadees here in the Sierra Nevada, and right on the other side of the Sierra Nevada, there's chestnutback chickadees. But mountain chickadees are one of the species that's really specific to the West and Western North America and Western coniferous forests. And these are really highly resident birds. And this, you can see this is an eBird map, or this is a map from the Cornell lab, powered by eBird data. So some of your observations of mountain chickadees in the Sierra might have helped generate this range map, which is really fun. But chickadees, right? So mountain chickadees go all the way up to almost Canada, all the way down to northern Mexico. So like in southern Arizona and even New Mexico. But really coniferous forest specialists, these are highly resident, non-migratory species that rely on conifer cones and pine seeds within those conifer cones to survive and stay resident. So it's a really special species. And we happen to study mountain chickadees at our long-term field site at Sachem Experimental Forest, which is north of Truckee, California. So across the border, about 45 minutes away from the University of Nevada campus. And we have 2 sites up there. So I said that we're going to be studying cognition, right? And specifically spatial learning and memory. And so what does that mean? And what do you mean that a small bird has memories, right? And can remember things and recall memories? Well, it all focuses around this one trait of mountain chickadees that is extremely important to their biology and their survival and their persistence in the Sierra Nevada and some of these montane environments. And that's that they're food caching species. And so food caching just simply means, like, if you have a pantry at home and you have a bunch of, I don't know, dried pasta, cans of soup, etc., you're a food cacher. However, you're a larder hoarder, which means that you have all of your stuff in one place. And if I were to, I'm not going to do it, but if I came in and robbed your home and I found your hoard, right, I could steal all your stuff. Well, so there's a variety of different hoarders, right? And so there are squirrels, which are larder hoarders, similar to maybe our style. Where they hide all of their food items in one place. And these specific individuals don't necessarily have to have good memories to remember where those stores are hidden. Mountain chickadees do hide food, but they hide food in what's called a scatter hoarding style. And that means that they hide individual food items in small, discrete spatial locations across the landscape. And they have extremely good memory abilities to go back to some of those hidden places to recover those food items in order to consume them, in order to survive, especially during the winter months. And when I say scatter hoarding, right, they're hiding individual items, and an individual chickadee can hide tens to even hundreds of thousands of individual food items across its forest habitat. And this series of pictures taken by Vladimir Pravosudov just shows a chickadee in its caching. And so this guy, he's sticking a cache into the bark of this mountain hemlock tree at our halonation site, extracting his bill, and then staring back at us saying, "Are you going to steal this? You better not steal it." And so, as you'd imagine, right, scatter hoarders are much less prevalent to thievery, right, because they hide food everywhere. However, it comes with a cost, and that cost is having to have the memory, the brains, and able to go back and recover those caches. And so I'm talking about all these sophisticated things and behaviors, and you're like, what the heck? I've heard that, in my case, my father, right, called me a bird brain growing up. And that was an insult, right? I thought birds didn't have good brains. And so it's actually, I just want you to know, from now on, everyone is required to go on and say, next time you call somebody a bird brain, it's a compliment. And what I mean by that is that a long time ago, comparative neuroanatomists looked at the outside of a brain. And so this is a songbird brain right here, and this is a human brain. And normally all the folds on the outside of the brain means more storage area. It just means more volume, which means more neurons, and more neurons is a good thing, right? Because you can store more information, and overall, you're capable of higher complex cognitive processes. Well, and so they looked at the smooth brain of songbirds and birds in general, and they said, well, they must be inferior creatures. And so that's kind of what reflects by this. So this pink color reflects kind of lower processing, just lower level brain matter. And so we have some too, right? And this is our human brain. But it turns out after the modern view and when the avian brain was re-examined, this top smooth part of the brain is very much capable of really complex cognitive function. And that's kind of referred to as the neopalladium. And that's very comparable to our human cerebrum. So this green stuff right here. So as you can see, this modern view down here is green, right? And so moral of the story, birds are brilliant. And next time somebody calls you a bird brain, take it as a compliment. And later, I'm just going to be referring to a part of a neuron, right? And so harken back to your biology days where you remember that brains are built of individual neurons, just kind of all clustered together. The neurons are made of several different parts, including the dendrites, the soma, and the axon, which are all just different ways that they connect and can pass information. We're going to be focused on the soma just later. Just remember that cell body, that soma, just for a few minutes. So anyway, so we just talked about bird brains, right? And so why does that matter, and how does that relate to mountain chickadees, and how do we actually look at individual differences, even in brains and in behavior in mountain chickadees in the Sierra Nevada? Well, we happen to study them, in our field site at the experimental forest is situated across what's called a montane elevation gradient in the Sierra Nevada. And our montane elevation gradient is characterized by what's called a snow line. And when I say the word snow line, you may look at this image and see where, as you go up the mountain, up the montane gradient, the mountain gradient, you run into where snow all of a sudden kind of appears, and it's like a horizontal line across the mountain. Well, a snow line is defined as a proximate elevation that we're in during transitional periods of the year, such as during spring and fall months. Snow or precipitation at higher elevations above that snow line is more likely to fall as snow, and precipitation below that snow line at lower elevations is more likely to fall as rain. And so what that means in general is that the environments at higher elevations in montane environments have more snow for longer periods, and thus colder temperatures for longer periods. And so it's a more harsh environment compared to lower elevations. And so one of the things that we've been looking at in chickadees is whether or not birds that are living in harsher conditions might cache more food, might have better abilities to find said cache food in order to survive those harsher winter climates. Because remember, mountain chickadees are highly resident, and they don't fly to Hawaii every winter and lay on the beach, right? They stay within these coniferous forests in our Sierra Nevada. And so we wanted to know whether or not there was differences across even montane elevational gradients. And so at our field site, our snow line is at approximately 2,100 meters. And we have two specific sites that we collect all sorts of data from different kind of groups of the population of chickadees across this montane elevation gradient. And one is at a lower elevation, which is about 1,900 meters, and the other is at a higher elevation at about 2,400 meters. And so if you don't believe me that there's this elevation gradient, these are two pictures, one from our high elevation, characterized by that more harsh climate, right? Those colder temperatures and higher snow levels. And this picture is from our low elevation environment. And these two pictures were taken on the exact same day in June. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with chickadee breeding habits, chickadees are starting to build nests in approximately mid-April / the end of April. So these guys at high elevation, even when there's all this snow around, are building nests and laying eggs even in these different environments, right? So very, very different environments that they have to live in and hang out in and thrive. And so we have been testing whether or not there's differences between these populations at these two elevations for quite some time. And to just summarize that past work, right? So I mentioned that caching behavior has long been hypothesized to be critical for surviving these harsh winters in the Sierra Nevada. But are there differences between even high and low elevations in the mountains of these chickadees? And I mentioned the brain earlier, and specifically when we're thinking about spatial learning and memory, there's one area of the brain that is very much integrally tied to those functions, and that's the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is responsible for storing spatial memory abilities. And there's been really cool studies that have shown that the volume of the hippocampus in a taxi cab driver in London back before the GPS was actually larger than the average person who lived in London who took the taxi that didn't have to learn all the streets and the back alleys, etc. So we wanted to know whether there are differences in the hippocampus. And our birds, like they've been detected in other animals, including humans, and we found that the birds at higher elevation did have differences in the hippocampus, and I'll show you those in a minute. We found that high versus low birds, they did cache more, and that's likely because they had to store more food in order to consume that food to survive that harsher environment. And then something that I'll be getting into a little bit later was that they performed better on a spatial learning task. And so we can test them, and we tested them in the laboratory before we went out into the wild. And we found these differences on this learning task in the laboratory and in the wild, and that high elevation birds actually show better learning and memory performance. And so that, if you think of a really good example of this is if you have essentially the anatomy, right, for a certain behavior, so in this case, differences in the hippocampus, so a larger hippocampus and more neurons, you should have differences in behavior. And so that's exactly what we see, right? So high elevation birds have larger hippocampus and they also have better memory. And then something that I'll go over again, but juvenile birds with better spatial memory performance are more likely to survive in our system. And so, and I'll touch on that a little bit later in what that essentially means for our system. This is what I mean. So I told you to remember that the soma of the neuron cell. And so these associated, right, with those two pictures again, this harsh environment and this mild environment, if you look at the differences in the hippocampus here, these purple globs, if you just use your imagination, this large purple glob right here and this smaller purple glob, those are the somas of the neurons in the hippocampus. And so there are more neurons and there were larger neurons. And essentially the larger neurons are capable of firing more and storing more information, right, in a relative term. And so you can see there's differences in those brain morphology, which is really cool stuff. And that's because they had to hang out in environments like this, right? So this is a picture from our field site. This is the service road that you can see kind of looking down the service road. We had to snowshoe up this particular day, and this is in the middle of a snowstorm. And so this is, you know, this is a cold, snowy habitat that these guys have to live in and have to manage and survive in. And so one of the things that we found in the past is that juvenile birds, and we've compared them in a cohort fashion, which means it's essentially you think about it as these birds are trying to finish high school. But essentially this is actually surviving their first winter. But so they're a junior class, or excuse me, like a senior class, trying to make it through their senior year in high school, right? Trying to graduate. And in the case of chickadees, it's trying to survive, right? It's trying to survive their first winter. And so before the harsh winter, we actually looked, or during the harsh winter, we looked at these chickadees, we measured their spatial learning and memory abilities. And then the next year, we saw who came back and who was more likely to survive. And we found the chickadees that graduated, okay, survived in the case of Mountain Chickadees, were the ones with better spatial learning and memory. And what this shows in a nutshell is that this trait is really critical for Mountain Chickadee survival, right? So caching and the ability to remember where they cache food so in order to go back and consume that food is really critical for these birds to just persist and survive in the Sierra Nevada. But we still saw some of these birds that showed up and tested, we still saw some that performed very poorly on our task. And so why were these guys here, right? And so we still saw variation in our population. They're not all superstars and not everybody graduates. And so that's where some of my dissertation work comes in, and how I want to know specifically what might be the drivers of some of that variation in the population, why some birds are worse than others, and why we see continued variation. We see variation every year. Not all birds graduate every single year. And you might be asking yourself, why is there a rat on the screen now? Well, we don't know a whole lot of how development and differences in early development, aka when birds are in the egg or in the nest and developing, we don't know much about, especially in wild systems, how early development affects future cognitive abilities. But we know a lot in mice and rats and other lab animals, right? And we know there's a few examples in birds too, but they're all in the lab. They're all highly controlled in lab conditions. And we study birds in the field and in the wild. So we're really curious on whether not differences in the early developmental environment, differences in the nest and how mom feeds might relate to why we see more variation in cognitive traits in mountain chickadees. And so we dove in to do that. And so let's go back to actually how we measure this behavior. So you're saying you see a lot of differences in spatial memory, but how the heck are you doing that? Well, so my advisor, Vladimir Pravosudov, as well as a number of collaborators, developed a really unique system of what's called radio frequency identification equipped feeders. And so this is what these guys look like. So this is a chickadee interacting with one of these feeders, and this is a spatial array of these feeders. So this is 8 feeders hanging in the air. And so we have to get to these feeders, and we do all of these cognitive experiments and collection of cognitive data in the middle of the winter when these birds are caching seeds and when these birds are relying on seeds to survive. So we have a whole number of equipment that allows us to get up there, like snow-tracked four-wheel drive vehicles. We work in great conditions with lots of beautiful snowstorms, and we have other crazy equipment like a pack of snowmobiles. We have 3 snowmobiles now that also allow us to get to our high elevation sites and just play in the snow in the Sierra Nevada in order to get some of this data. So back to our radio frequency identification equipped feeders. So all of our chickadees are banded with what's called a pit tag. And that's this white tag right here, this larger band on this bird's leg. And you might have heard of a passive integrated transponder because you might have a pet that has a passive integrated transponder or a pit tag in the neck of your pet, just in case your pet runs away, gets lost. Somebody can scan that pit tag, get an individual ID, and then bring it back to you, right? Well, our chickadees have pit tags on their legs that the feeders with their radio frequency technology can actually scan. And so if you watch this video, this bird lands on the black perch of this feeder, which is actually an antenna. That antenna scans the purple pit tag on that bird's leg and opens a door for that chickadee in order for it to grab a seed. You can see him, he's a little picky. He only takes the second seed he chooses. He doesn't like the first one. But he pulls the seed out and then he takes it away and either eats it or caches it or whatever. But that allows us to, that feeder has a number of pieces of technology inside of it that allows us to detect the time and the individual chickadee visiting the feeder. And so, like I said, there's an array of 8, and so this is what it looks like from the bottom. And this allows us to actually assign individual chickadees only one feeder in space. So either one on this side or on this side, right, in order to test how well they remember a spatial location. And so how it begins is we tag as many birds as we can. And so I was actually up in the woods all day today, tagging chickadees with passive integrated transponders. And then we expose them to our feeder array. And when they come visit the feeder array initially, all 8 feeders are opening for any bird that has a pit tag. So it doesn't matter where they land and what spatial location that they're using, every single feeder opens for them and they can get seeds. But when we actually are ready for the experiment, we assign individual birds a specific spatial location. So from now on, this is the only feeder that's going to be opening for this individual. And so what a spatial memory and learning trial might look like is when a bird comes and visits the array, it might sample feeders that are no longer rewarding. So you might go over here, oh, that feeder door doesn't open for him anymore. You might sample a second feeder, still it doesn't open for him until he finds his rewarding feeder, and boom, he gets that reward, he gets the seed, he might take it away, he might cache that seed, he might eat it. But then when he returns to the feeder the next time, it's really critical because, okay, he learned, right? Because he went directly to that previously rewarding feeder. And what that looks like over time is that when a chickadee visits a feeder the first time, it might make 3 errors before finding its feeder, might make 2 errors the next time, but then it might never make an error again. And so you can see, if you imagine like a little learning curve, right? This is improvement over time, and this is learning, right? So we can generate learning curves for these birds, and then we can measure specifically how great their memory is on these specific tasks. And we can assign specific metrics of memory to individual birds and their specific performance. And to give you an example of how good these chickadees are at learning spatial locations, if you remember, we have 8 feeders. And so if they were just sampling at random, they would be making approximately 4 out of 8 errors every time they visited the feeders, right? Because they would be randomly sampling until they found their rewarding feeder. But if they're getting less than 4 errors, that means that they have learned a pattern. And so when we look at we look over sometimes hundreds of trials, and we average hundreds of trials that these birds participate in. And on average, some of these birds make 0.1 errors. So 0.1 out of 8. So a lot of times they make an error during their first sampling of the feeder, and then they never make any errors again. That's how fast they learn, and that's how well they retain the memory of that specific spatial location. That's really cool. So these are really special birds. So like I mentioned before, I'm interested in how these birds, right? So how they behave on these spatial learning tasks and all of this variation in memory that we see with some birds doing really, really well and some doing poorly and some surviving and some not surviving. How do we have individuals that are coming into the population that perform really poorly? Because this is a trait that should be really important for these birds, and we know that it's selected on, and so we know that it's important. We know that birds with better memories do better, and so what might be generating the variation we see? And some of that might be parental behaviors, such as when these chickadees are actually in the nest, how much the parents feed them. And so we use our radio frequency technology to actually measure parental visitation too. So here's a little copper antenna that when these little adorable nestlings that are about 9 days old, right, when parents are going in and out of this door, this copper antenna scans the parents as they come in, so we can see how many times the parents are feeding. We can measure different aspects of the nest. So what kind of materials are they using? Lichens, these little small chips of wood, animal fur, and whether or not those correspond to differences in behavior. And so we monitor this stuff really closely. And this is a video of one of our chickadees coming in. This is a female during nest building. And that's one of the things that I'm really fascinated with, and we've been doing a lot of work on, is just variation and differences in nests that we see in mountain chickadees as well. And I can talk about that if anybody has any specific questions, but that's not what we're going to be focusing on today necessarily. But that, we monitor these chickadees across their development. And so this guy, I believe this guy's like 4 days old, this weird little guy. So he's completely blind, right? And he thinks that he's begging. And this just shows a mom sitting on her eggs as they hatch. And this is the dad who just came in and fed the female. And so we monitor these boxes really closely and all throughout development in order to measure and try to detect what differences in development might look like for these birds. So how do we actually look for differences in development in these young birds? And how do we actually measure differences in development? And how do we compare those measurements to their future cognitive abilities? So this is a nestling at 16 days old. And this is when we put a little federal band on its leg to track it across its development. But what we do when we catch these birds at our feeders, and we know that they're a bird that hatched earlier that year, so we know it's a juvenile bird and it hasn't tested yet, is we take a sample of one outer tail feather. And tail feathers are in all feathers, but tail feathers in mountain chickadees are large enough that we can do this. But feathers are really unique in that they provide a cumulative summary of cort, or corticosterone, which is the avian stress hormone, which is equivalent in mammals to cortisol. But stress hormone is an oversimplification, but essentially it is a measurement of overall kind of like metabolic stress and activity during development. And we can look inside this feather, we can actually extract the cumulative amount of cort across its development, because if you look very closely, you can see kind of a dark, light, dark, light, dark, light horizontal stripes across these feathers. And those are the daily growth bars. And so that's the daily and nightly growth of feathers. And as feathers are grown, blood is in that feather, and the levels of circulating stress hormone are actually deposited in the feather. And so it acts as like a little time capsule of developmental stress. And then we take the whole feather, we extract it for all of that cort, and then we can use what's called an ELISA, which is a molecular method to actually measure the differences in concentration of that stress hormone in individual feathers, and then relate it back to cognitive performance. And so for this study, and this was done across 3 years, we predicted that we would see variation between and within elevations. So we think that there might be some good years, some bad years, and so some years showing higher levels of cort and some years showing lower levels of cort. But we also predicted that higher levels of corticosterone would correlate to poor performance on spatial learning and memory. And so all of those past in-lab experiments have shown that animals, when they're exposed to extreme stress during development, whether that's neonatal development or even stress within the egg or stress after birds hatch, that animals that have more stress have poor performance on cognitive tasks. And that's because they're putting more energy into just surviving and persisting rather than making more neurons in their brain, right? Because the brain and all of those structures that I showed you on that earlier slide of avian brain cells and parts, they require a lot of energy to create and make and maintain. And if animals don't have the energy to do that, if they're fighting off infection or some other thing, and they have this levels of high court that allows to detect that, they might not be able to put more into their cognitive development. And that might lead to why we have birds flying around that perform a little bit worse on our spatial learning and memory tasks. But we wanted to actually test to see if that was true. And so this is some of the data that we found, and don't worry, I don't have too much data. But we measured this, and this is picograms per millimeter of feather, so really tiny amounts of corticosterone. And we didn't find differences in elevation. So despite what some of these graphs might look like, statistically, there's actually no differences in elevation across all these years. And so this study was from 2018 to 2020. But we did find, we did find one difference in between years. And so 2020 actually had the lowest level of court deposition in the feathers of all the years. And so what does that mean? And what can we learn from that? Well, so then we looked at cognitive performance. And so this is location error. So what we're actually measuring. So actually the higher you go on this y-axis, the worse, right? So the more errors that they're making. So remember I said that there are some birds that are capable of like 0.1 errors. These are all juvenile birds. So these are on average perform worse than adults. And so you can see some are making even 2.5 errors up here, right? So they're still learning, but they're not learning as well. But we wanted to know whether or not location errors corresponded to court, whether or not if there was more court in the feather, if that corresponded to worse performance on the spatial learning test that we do. And we did actually find a result only in a single year, only in 2018 and only at one elevation. So that was a year that we had really poor sample size for our low elevation site. We had very good sample size for our high elevation site. And we found that strong relationship there, but only at that one elevation. So, and it's exactly as we predicted that it would be. However, in the following years, in 2019 and 2020, all relationships just kind of disappeared. And so we did still see lots of variation in both cognitive performance and court, but the relationship between location errors, right? So their performance and their stress levels disappeared in the next one. We didn't find any significant relationships. And so what does that mean? So we found that there is variation, and 2020 had the lowest levels. We didn't find any differences in court deposition across elevations, which is something that we did predict. But we did find that only in a single year that higher levels did correlate with worse performance on a memory test, but that was only in 1 year. So we still have a lot to learn and a lot to explain. And so how do we go about possibly explaining some of these observed patterns? Well, a lot of it might just be local climate, right? So there's large variation in snow and temperature across years, and that could be driving some of these patterns of variation that we see in performance. If, for example, if juvenile birds can't make it to the feeders or can't make it to the feeders in one day, or there's just large snow levels during breeding season that can lead to more stress during development. There's all sorts of possible explanations for some of this variation. Another big possibility is that there is year-to-year differences in food availability, and that's both in abundance and diversity of prey items. And so chickadees are generalists when it comes to feeding insect prey. And so you can see this guy right here has some insect larvae in its bill, and they feed almost all sorts of insects, right? But one of the we have seen variation in this, and this is actually future work that we're trying to do, is we're actually going to take fecal samples from nestlings, so poop samples, and look to see, because we can actually sequence DNA from the feces of chickadees to actually understand what the parents are feeding them. And so that's some of the next steps behind this, but there could be differences in year-to-year food availability that shows differences in court, but that it actually might not affect their cognitive abilities directly either. And so if you don't believe me that there's yearly variation in climate, this is just some of the snow levels that we've seen. And I include 2017 here because this is the year that led up to the 2018 breeding season. But you can just see tremendous snow depth. So this is 250 inches, right, at its height. We had another heavy snow year in 2019. And so there could be carryover effects actually on the insect population from these high levels of snow. And so if there are critical insects that chickadees need to feed their nestlings for proper development, some of these might be impacted by these really high snow levels. So in 2017, for example, the spring of 2018 might not have as much insect prey around. And even drought years from like 2018 could carry over even into 2020, which some of the folks working on insects in the Sierra Nevada at UNR say that lower levels of snow can also be just as devastating as high levels. So all these are really interesting things to investigate in the future. So like I said, some future data that I still need to collect is differences between the growth rates of these chickadee feathers. So I mentioned that we can actually measure, right, the daily and nightly growth of these feathers, and then the overall 24-hour growth period of feathers through these growth bars. And captive studies have shown that the width of those growth bars correspond to not what they're being fed, but the amount of food they're being given. And so we can look to see whether or not birds that are growing faster might have more stress or better performance on spatial cognition, and that might be driving some variation that we see. And then another really tantalizing tidbit is that spiders might be playing a role in our chickadees, and specifically because spiders have a large amount of this molecule called taurine, and taurine has been shown to be a neuroprotectant, which essentially means, and so for in a lab experiment, when scientists stressed a rat, for example, during early development and got levels of cortisol through the roof, really stressed, and but then injected it with taurine, it actually saved its cognitive development. And as an adult, it performed very well on cognitive tasks, versus an individual that received the same stress, but without the taurine, performed horribly and had poor cognitive development. And we know that there are some populations of chickadees that preferentially feed more or less spiders, or at least specifically seek out spiders in their habitats to feed their nestlings. And spiders in general aren't that nutritious besides this taurine molecule. And so one of the mechanisms that we think might be behind some of these differences, different levels of cort that we see, but lack of impact on their cognitive performance, might mean that might be because chickadees are actually feeding their nestlings essentially kind of a treatment to prevent them from having cognitive decline, because cognition is so important in these birds and the ability to develop cognition. But that is something that we're working on in the future. That's just a possible explanation at this point, but it's a really tantalizing one, as we have all sorts of indirect evidence that that spiders might be influencing some of these effects. And so overall, the association between developmental stress and spatial cognition is it's not consistent across conditions. And that's not surprising, right? Because this is in a wild population. There's all sorts of small impacts like spiders, like differences in nutrition, differences in parental involvement that we didn't measure in this population that could be driving this association. And so that's not surprising, but we did find that one relationship. So it's exciting, and it's very interesting that we don't see a consistent relationship between those two things. And food caching species just may have evolved a mechanism, right, to protect the spatial cognition from these developmental perturbations, right? And so like I described earlier, they might be specifically seeking out more spiders in their habitat to feed to their nestlings to protect them from cognitive destruction, if you will, right? And so specifically diet composition, these key nutrients may be a critical component of some such mechanism that's protecting chickadees during their early development. So this is And so just thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for all of my funders, including Western Field Ornithologists, the National Science Foundation, as well as ECB at University of Nevada, Reno, and our collaborators at Sage and Creek Field Station, and of course, all of my co-authors on this project. And I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That is just fascinating stuff. I mean, talk about fine-tooth comb level detail. That's just crazy. So I haven't seen any questions come in, but maybe now that we've prompted folks, we'll get some.
Well, we know lots and lots about our chickadees in our population, right? And so being able to track them across all sorts of different windows of time, including their early development and their first year in the winter and their previous testing years, has been extremely valuable and has answered all sorts of questions, but mostly just generated all sorts of new questions. Like I said, this was a really interesting project that required a ton of work, and to extract all the hormones from the feathers and to measure all these individual feathers and look into all these details. And then it just generated more questions.
Yeah, well, that tends to happen. So yeah, I still don't see any questions, but I just can't believe some of that stuff. It's fascinating. Like the bit about the spiders and taurine. Now, taurine, is that the same thing I see on the ingredients label in some energy drinks? Is that the same taurine?
Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I think it's I believe it's an amino acid. So.
Oh yeah, that's oh, we've got someone typing a question, so we'll hang on here for a second. Yeah.
Well, normally we try to test, and today we tagged, I think like around, it was a pretty poor day because it was so warm and we didn't have many chickadees visiting the feeders, but we tagged around 10 individuals today, and we try to tag, close to 100 individuals at each elevational site. And we have had in the past, several hundred birds test each season. And so we have a lot of cognitive data, and so the ones that stick around and the ones that test year after year too, we've actually shown that even in a 6-year-old bird, that there's no cognitive decline. They actually perform exceptionally well, even at 6 years of age, which is old for a chickadee, right?
And I was just gonna say, what do you reckon the average lifespan of a chickadee is? Probably not a whole lot more than 6 years.
Well, so the average lifespan, and it's, if you look up some of these really well-studied populations of coastal relatives and great tits, their average is 1, right? Or less than 1. So many youngsters die, right? But once they make it past that first year of life, we have a lot of 5-year-old birds, or 4 and 5-year-old birds. I think our oldest in the population was like about 9 or 10. And so really depending, some of the, it's something ridiculous that the oldest living blue tit in the UK it's something in the teens, I think, or even older. So some of these birds have the capacity to live quite a long time. It's just that there's a lot of stuff that they're up against.
It's just so impressive. You see these birds at your feeders, and you've got this notion of these cute little birds bouncing around, and there's just so much more going on. They're just tough little buggers. We've got Jen's question here. So she's wondering about quality of memory. She's wondering if it's possible that some of these poor memory individuals who will visit other feeders may actually be adaptive in some ways, given a changing climate with changing conditions and increasing phenological mismatches.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so for these birds, right, they are really, so a lot of the times when we're thinking about phenological mismatches, that's specifically in the case of populations that are migratory or that are relying on a food source that is ephemeral, right? So say neotropical migrants, right, are relying on insect populations that are starting to appear and regenerate every spring, right? And there can be mismatches in time when those birds are foraging, and they can maybe show up to breed and they're already past the peak of some insect level, right? And so for our chickadees, that's one of the things that we want to measure specifically for like the summer. That might apply in the summer during the breeding period when these guys are actually feeding young, because what we found, especially for our low elevation birds, is that they really start building nests really consistently across years in mid-April. And then that's when they're producing chicks, right? And so then there's a trickle of that reproduction as time goes on. And there could be mismatches in the prey availability then, right? If they're, for example, climate change moving forward, if some of the booms and busts of insect activity are earlier, before their nestlings are hatched and they're feeding their nestlings, that could be a major detriment to the chickadees, right? But for birds, that when we're talking about memory and when they rely on memory, that's specifically when we're talking about surviving in their winter habitat. And in the wintertime, the whole point of caching, right, is that they're providing for themselves a stable food source, right, that doesn't go anywhere, that's not ephemeral, and they're relying on their memory in order to go back and recover that food in order to survive, right? And so we don't exactly know what will happen with the changing environment to chickadees. It's very likely that they'll, essentially just get dumber and dumber, but as the climate warms, there'll be less need to rely on those caches as well, less need to rely on memory. And so that poor performance wouldn't necessarily be a mismatch, right? It would just be that the climate is not selecting on individuals with that higher quality memory anymore, because there's not an environment that requires that higher memory anymore. And one of the closest relatives of mountain chickadees that exists in North America, like the closest sister group, is Mexican chickadees. And Mexican chickadees, as far as we know, don't cache at all. And they live in these areas that there's insect prey available all year. They don't have to cache, so they don't, right? And so it could be a similar situation like that. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Yes, she says, very cool. And wondering if you've also looked at differences in memory quality versus quantity, like if a feeder does fewer but higher quality versus more often but lower quality food.
Okay, yeah, so that's, differences in memory.
Is it, yeah, are you able to see that as well? Should I read that
Okay,
again?
yeah, no, I'm reading it too, yeah. So it's, so I'm assuming that you mean, and Jen, can you type your response? I'm assuming you mean that it's the feeders providing higher or lower quality reward. Is that what you mean?
That is how I'm interpreting the question.
Yeah, that's.
Perhaps Jen will confirm.
I'll answer your question too, Beverly, I promise. Okay, Jen's responding as well.
Yes. That is
okay. Yeah. Okay. Feeder supply. Yeah. So one of the things that we really control for is that we only reward birds with black oil sunflower seeds, which, believe it or not, they come to, and it's just way too expensive for pine nuts to like stock them with pine nuts, because each of our 8 feeder arrays holds about 40 pounds of seed. And I don't know if you've been to Costco lately and looked at the pine nuts, but pricey. But we use black oil sunflower seeds, and we're very careful about what we supply. And so, because we want to control for motivation, right? And so motivation is really important. It's that it's kind of, these birds, because it's the wild, they all have the choice to interact with the feeders. And so there's differences in individuals' motivation, but that's kind of controlled for in this sense. And so we want to be same across the board for all of those resources. And so we've never manipulated differences in feeder, like what's available in feeders. If we did that, they would learn immediately. So chickadees and their other relatives in the UK with great tits and blue tits, differences in reward. So if you had a pine nut versus a black oil sunflower seed, and you put them in feeders across from each other in an array, they would learn. I have absolutely no doubt they would learn very soon and very immediately, and they would prefer, I'm sure, the fattier pine nut, and that's all they would visit until it was gone. And so they learn all sorts of associations, because this is associative learning, but it's associative learning of a spatial location, right? And so We could also paint the feeders different colors, and I'm sure they would learn that as well, to only go to a blue colored feeder, etc. And we wouldn't have to have them in a specific spatial array. Chickadees are just extremely fast learners, and they're good at that stuff. And then Beverly,
wasn't sure if you could also see the questions or if you need me to read them.
yeah, I can read this one since it's up in front of me. But Beverly Harry asks, does stress in birds ever serve a positive outcome, possibly in decision making or risks? Yeah, so there's all sorts of literature on how stress in all sorts of situations in life can lead leads to different effects, right? And a lot of that research is specifically done with taking samples of the stress hormone that I referred to in the talk that we measured in chickadee feathers, but directly from the bloodstream and actually looking at chickadees. And then, it's the hormone that's specifically tied to like the fight or flight response. And so you're absolutely right, Beverly, in that it's a really highly functional molecule, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing. And what I should have said during the main presentation is that when it is a bad thing is prolonged high levels of exposure to the hormone. And so if a chickadee is being raised in a nest that is really stressed all the time and has a lot of stress hormone all the time, that can lead to developmental stress, right, and poor development. If birds have just spikes of that hormone around, that can serve all sorts of positive purposes, including responding to a predator and other sorts of risks. And so you're absolutely right. But we measured kind of the average exposure to the hormone across the entire developmental window, which is around like 25 days. And so we were looking at whether or not like high amounts of exposure affected that development, right? So it's a little bit different from the day-to-day and even hourly to hourly kind of ups and downs of stress hormone that we all as individuals experience every day, and what these birds also experience every day. And so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that is really cool stuff, Ben. Thanks so much for sharing. We really appreciated it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one question in the chat about Chickadee Ridge.
Oh, so there is. There is. So do you have thoughts on feeding chickadees from the hand at places like that? There's apparently talk on Facebook about whether this is a healthy thing for the species or not. And what is your opinion on this interaction? Do you think this should be discouraged? Very interesting stuff. So what's your take on that, Ben? Because I certainly have thoughts as well.
Yeah. Well, so what I will say about that is that there was discussion a while ago. I mean, I think this was last winter maybe, and it was suggested that feeding the chickadees at Chickadee Ridge somewhat like it disrupts their caching behavior and it can affect their survival, and that chickadees are relying on people's handouts at Chickadee Ridge to survive. And I will just say that that's not true. Chickadees are still caching all of the available resources around them all the time. They have all sorts of wild caches that they cached months before, or way before people are out feeding them. And so it doesn't disrupt their behaviors in that sense, and they don't rely on that human interaction for survival at all either. And the other thing that I will say is that habituating any animal, any wild animal, whether it's a bear or a bird, right, to human interaction and being comfortable with human interaction is not good, right? However, Chickadee Ridge is an established population of birds that are extremely habituated, and it's probably not going to go away anytime soon. And so if you do interact with that population, just do so responsibly. So do not feed them sandwiches. Do not feed them meat, meat, bread, whatever. Go with black oil, sunflower seeds, or pine nuts, and just interact respectfully and responsibly. So that's what I'll say about those guys.
That pretty much echoes my own thoughts. My first experience at Chickadee Ridge was I didn't even realize I was in the right place until a chickadee landed on my head when I stopped for a second. So I
I
didn't even have seed to give them.
Yeah, if I go to Chickadee Ridge in the winter, I carry extra seed with me, and I swat unnecessary objects out of people's hands and give them black oil sunflower seeds to feed the chickadees instead of sandwich bread. So bring extra seed if you do go. Then Beverly has one other question too. Can you go over the snow line again? Is this the temperature line strata for the mountain? That's an interesting question, Beverly. I don't know what a temperature line strata is, so I'll just say that right off the bat. And I'll say that a snow line is, like I said, it's a relative elevation, and that it varies, and it does vary across all mountain ranges, right, in conditions. And so the specific elevation that I gave you on my top slide and in the talk is specific to our field site. And essentially it's, it's just that it's a kind of a transitional zone around that, and it must have something to do where temperature does shift as you go up into higher elevations along that montane elevation gradient. And like I said, it's just the probability changes. So the probability of the precipitation falling as snow above that snow line during fall and spring months just increases, right, at those environments. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't not rain, right, during spring at our high elevation site. But in general, if you look at across years, we just see tremendous differences in temperature and just the amount of snow and colder temperatures above that snow line that just persist for longer into the spring. And so that's how we normally interpret it. But I'm sorry that I don't know what a temperature line strata is. And I hope that answers your question.
Well, I don't see a follow-up, so I assume that that has covered the bases. Because you'll also hear talk of snow line per different storms. You know, you'll hear the weather forecasters referring to this storm is going to be a low snow line versus, you know.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's yes, yeah, and that goes way beyond my expertise. If you don't trust your normal weatherman, you should absolutely not trust me.
That's a some good closing advice for the audience. We have any more questions out there, or shall we wrap it up here? I don't see anything else coming in.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank the audience again for letting me get sciencey and digging into some complex topics. I really appreciate you guys listening. And if you guys do have any further questions or want to follow up, just remember to visit chickadeecognition.com, and all my contact information is right there if you guys want to reach out in the future.
Do you want to type that into the chat for folks, Ben, so they can actually refer to that later?
I'd be happy to. That's great. A good idea.
That'd be wonderful. And then anyone who found the registration for this webinar knows how to get in touch with us here at GBBO, so we can always make the connection. So thanks again, Ben. That was really fascinating stuff. We enjoyed having you.
Yeah, well, again, thanks to you and thanks to GBBO.
All right, everybody. On that note, we're going to sign off. So well, before I do, I'll mention next week and for the following 3 Wednesdays, we have presentations via Zoom. You can see registration information on our website and our social media. We've got some neat upcoming stuff on monarch butterflies, house wrens, and then actually I'll be giving a talk about the Nevada Bird Records Committee in a few weeks. So that's all for this evening. Thanks everyone, and have a good night.